Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom. Today, the first day of the 2-day Rosh Chodesh of the coming month of Adar. Today being the 30th of Shevat of the year 5778, the last day of the month, on the threshold of the month in which Marbin B'Simcha, we multiply and expand, God willing, our Simcha, our holy joy. And today we'll be continuing with our studies in the prophet Hosea, today in chapter 8. And after that we shall be looking at some interesting questions arising with respect to the prohibition of the consumption of blood and throwing light on the depth meaning of the prohibition of blood from the writings of Rabbi Natan of Breslev, the leading student of Rabbi Nachman, writing his discourses on the meaning of the body of the law in the light of the inner soul of the Kabbalah. With that, let us turn now to our study of Hosea chapter 8. Shalom. Today, the 30th of Shevat of the year 5778, first day of Rosh Chodesh Adar, corresponding to the 15th of February of the year 2018. And today we continue our studies of the prophet Hosea in chapter 8, which is in fact in the written Hebrew texts of Hosea, the continuation of chapter 7, the continuation of a long parasha. And there is a shift in the sense here, whereas previously the prophet has been giving his reproof to the people about how the basic sin of appointing Jeroboam, Yerab'am, who went off in the direction of idolatry, has led to all of the other troubles that are going to threaten the future of Ephraim, that Ephraim is going to be like an unwanted loaf tossed on the coals and thrown into exile on account of the sin of like bakers baking preparing the dough and stoking the fire to bring their wicked plans to conclusion. Now, beginning in chapter 8, God is addressing the prophet, telling the prophet to raise his voice like the shofar horn, summoning the people to defense in time of war and for other necessary proclamations. The shofar is the emblem of prophecy, and once again in the continuation, the prophet is going to go on with this analysis of the reasons for the coming exile of Ephraim and the going astray of Judah. And at this point, I think it's perhaps timely to stop for a moment to recall that Hosea was in fact the first of all of those that we considered to be the prophets. In fact, the books of Joshua, Samuel 1 and 2, and Kings 1 and 2 are also considered to be the works of the prophets, but it is really people associated with the great prophecies of the Tanakh, the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And it's noteworthy that all of that great trio were all after Hosea. While Isaiah was a younger contemporary and a student of Hosea, Jeremiah and Ezekiel were both prophesying several generations afterwards at the time of the destruction of King Solomon's temple. And here in our time, the time of Hosea, the temple was still standing as it was at the beginning of during the time of Isaiah and at the beginning of Jeremiah and the beginning of Ezekiel. It was in the lifetimes of Jeremiah and Ezekiel the temple was destroyed. But here Hosea is really the father of the prophets, and I think it's timely to take note of the style of Hosea, a very, very terse style compared to the flowing melitza, the eloquence of Isaiah in tremendously flighty passages with dazzling wordplay, and likewise the eloquence of Jeremiah in his pain at witnessing what is happening to his people. But here the prophet is standing, as it were, on the high mountain of holiness and looking at the national malaise and expressing this in very, very terse terms compared to the diversity of the structure of verses in many places in Isaiah. The structure of the Hebrew verses in Hosea is for the most part very static, and one verse follows the other with very similar patterns of the Ta'amei HaMikra, the notes of the cantillation, which are guide to the meaning. So with that said today, let us turn now to our text of Hosea chapter 8, when after the continuing on from the previous reproofs, God now says to the prophet, Elechikecho shoifor kanesher ale beis Adonai Yahan avedu verisihi viale toirosihi poshohu. A very serious castigation from this father of the prophets here, as he says to the prophet, the reason why the horn has been put to your mouth is because there is like an eagle swooping down on against the house of the Lord, against the temple. This is what is happening. El chikech shofar, to your chech, to the palate of your mouth, there shall be the shofar of prophecy. And what is the prophecy? Kanesher al beis Adonai, like an eagle that is upon the house of the Lord, an eagle swooping down. That is, as Rashi tells us, the enemies who's coming against the temple of Solomon is prophesied already. And why? Yan ovru berisi, because they have transgressed my covenant. Ve'al toirosi posho, against my Torah have they rebelled. And now, mockingly, the prophet is putting forth the word of God at what is going to happen when the troubles strike. Li yiz'aku Elohai yedanucho Yisrael. This is a future verb. To me then shall they cry out, oh my God, we have known you, we are attached to you. This is the very criticism that the prophet has given across the people. In the name of Hashem, you have despised da'at, despised the knowledge of God. Israel has become bereft of the knowledge of God, and they will say in a moment of denial, Yedanucho, have we not known you, surely? But the prophet answers again with this very terse statement in verse 3, Zonach Yisroel tov Israel have despised what is good, namely the covenant and the Torah, and for that reason the enemy shall chase after him. And here going back now to the root of the problem, verse 4. Heim himelichuhu veloi mimeni heisiru veloi yodoti kaspom uzahavam asuhu lohem atzabim leman yikoreis. It is they that appointed a king and not from me. Says God, the original appointing of the king over Israel was not God's initiative. Hesiru v'lo yodati. They appointed ministers, and it's as if I did not know. That is to say, that all of the kings that they appointed from Jeroboam, with the exception of 2 kings of Israel, says the Metzudat David on this verse, with the exception of 2 kings of Israel, that is Jeroboam and Yehu ben Nimshi, it was these 2 kings who were appointed prophetically. We see that in the time of Rehavam, the prophet Achia Hashiloni takes Yeravam ben Nevat, who has already made a mark for himself as standing up to Solomon when Solomon began expanding the city of Jerusalem for the sake of his foreign wives, at the expense of space for the people, and Yeravam stood up against this and subsequently had to flee because Solomon sought his life, and Yeravam came back in the time of Rehavam, Solomon's son. And so as Metzudat David tells us on this verse, the 10 tribes made their own kings. They didn't ask from God, because all of the different kings they appointed on their own volition, with the exception of Yeravam and Yehu. Yehu also was appointed king prophetically by a message from the prophet Elisha, who sent his student, who was Yonah, the prophet, to announced that Yehu ben Nimshi will be the one to take vengeance on the house of Achav. But here we have the very deep critique of Israel politically, that the trouble started when they wanted to throw off the divine authority of the Torah and the covenant and make Israel a political entity. And going back to the text, Kaspom uzahavam osu lehem atzabim, their silver and their gold they made for themselves into idols, which could both mean that they have made physical idols like the calves that Yeravam made, and the a Targum on this verse says that they used the silver and the gold they took up from Egypt to make abominations, and in another sense this could also mean that they turned the pursuit of physical wealth of silver and gold into their goal of life, which is itself an idolatry, and that will be their undoing, yikares, in order they shall be cut off. And we heard before that Israel despised all good. That was the very word at the beginning of verse 3, Zonach Yisrael Tov. And now the vengeance in verse 8, Zonach Eglech Shomron Chor Apibom Ad Mosai Lo Yuchelu Nikoyon. Zonach Eglich Shomron, he has rejected and despised your calf, your idolatrous cult, Samaria, Shomron, Chora api bom, my anger is burning against them. Ad mosai lo yuchlu nikoyon, for how long will they never be able to attain purity? Verse 6, Ki mi Yisrael vehu chorosh asahu ve'loi Elohim hu ki shevovim yeh Egel Shomron. Rashi explains on this verse, verse 6, Ki mi Yisrael vahu, that Mikaspom v'zavom shel kol echad ve'echad ugavui, from the silver and the gold of each and every single one of them was this levied. V'harash aso, it was the craftsman that made it. V'havov shel vehu nofel. Here Rashi makes a comment on the grammatical status of the Hebrew word in the text, vehu, ki misrael vehu, where Rashi says that for whatever mystical reasons this might be in the text, when it comes to the grammar, nofel, it falls out, we take it out. Rashi says, Yesh habe voven domin lo. There are many other cases in scriptures similar to this, where he now begins to quote from Ezekiel chapter 46. Rashi says, as the pshat, Afkan Misrael as monosoi bachonosoi. It was from Israel that was the preparation and the completion of this work. Vehu nasa, that was how it was made. Here Rashi is giving a simple meaning by saying the vov need not be taken into account. But now he comes to explain how it could be interpreted, taking the vav into account. We could, the way we could settle a satisfactory meaning out of this vav, Kain ki Yisrael vahu. Yes, indeed, this came out, and that one. That is to say, both this calf that they set up in Shomron, the calf of Jeroboam, just like the calf, the first calf, that is the calf in the wilderness. Well, I think Rashi is explaining to us a very important point, because Rashi is once again drawing out the parallelism between the sin of the 10 tribes with the calf that Jeroboam set up and its root in the calf that was made in the wilderness. In other words, the way that we interpret the whole concept of the calf, where Israel wanted an intermediary, was the intermediary of the bitachon, the trust in wealth and security, as opposed to a wholehearted trust and faith in God and the Torah of God. This is the root flaw. So continuing now with our text, verse 6, the calf came out from Israel, and there it was made by a craftsman. It's not a god, it's simply splinters, and it will go to splinters. And now we have a more elaborate verse in terms of structure, expressing the devastation that will occur. Ki רוח יזרעו וסופוסו יקצרו. כמו אין אלוהי צמח בלי יעשה קמח, אולי יעשה זורים יבלעו. For wind it is that they are sowing, and a storm wind shall they harvest, a whirlwind shall they harvest. Como ein loi, this has no kama, no standing stalks of grain. Tzemach beli yaseh kemach. Here the poetry of the words. Tzemach beli yaseh kemach. Just a growth, but one that will not make any flower. Hulai yaseh, if perhaps it might do so. Zorim yivlo'u, strangers shall devour it. Once again, the image of this a loaf cast out that is quickly devoured and disappears. Verse 8, Nivala Yisrael, Ato hoyu v'goyim, Ki cheli ein chayfetz bo. Israel is literally consumed. Now they are among the nations like some cast out vessel that nobody has any desire for. This has been the history of Israel and the history of the Jews in exile for thousands of years. And here we see the father of the prophets, Hosea, prophesying this on the very threshold of the exile of the 10 tribes. Notice how this verse 8 goes back to the regular terse style as opposed to the more elaborate structure of verse 7, which was adding phrase after phrase the complete devastation that will occur. And now back to the stark structure of the verses. Verse 8, now verse 9. Ki heimo olu ashur pere boidei loi Ephraim hisanu ahovim. They've gone up to Assyria. As we've seen already, that both the kingdoms of the 10 tribes and of Judah were spending more time trying to involve the neighboring countries in their intrigues, one against the other. And it starts off with the northern kingdom, Ephraim, going up to Assyria to entreat help. And ironically, because Assyria is the one that is going to take them into exile. So the description of Ephraim in this quest for political alliances, the name Ephraim has the Hebrew letters Pera in it. Ephraim comes from the root of Poriah, of fruitfulness, but the root Pere, which is also there, was of a wild ass, and here and there stubbornness to try to forge strategic political alliances instead of trying to pursue the true national mission of God's Torah and covenant. This is like a prostitute who is courting friendship by making conditions, offering gifts. Verse 10, Kam ki yisnu v'goyim ato akabetzeim v'yochelu mi'ot mimaso melech sorim. Verse 10, even while they continue this exercise of courtship, the root of the word yisnu is not our more familiar word of giving, but this is a word related to the fee that a prostitute may expect from her client, which in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19, is called the Ethnan, Aleph Taf Nun Yud. And so this phrase has the connotation of flirting and trying to solicit favors and to buy favors. And even if Israel will persist in this behavior, even though they have done this and they've tried to secure their future through strategic political alliances, nevertheless, akabtzem, the promise of the prophet, God will gather Israel in. And v'yochelu ma'at, they will become humbled through the travails of their exile. They will become humbled mimaso melech sorim, from the burden of the king and the ministers. That is to say, the yoke of those to whom they were subjugated. So there is a very mixed mood in this verse here. On the one hand, Israel is continuing with this behavior. Nevertheless, God is gathering them in and will indeed humble their hearts precisely through this exile. And the reason for it all is because of this rampant idolatry. Verse 11, Ki hirebo Ephraim mizbechois lachatoi, hoyu loi mizbechois lachatoi. For Ephraim has multiplied their idolatrous altars, and for the sake of sinning, the true purpose of the altar is to serve as a focus for repentance. But here the idolatrous cults of the northern kingdom were to give a license to the people to follow their instincts, their lower instincts, and to sin. That was the result of these altars. So going further into the root of this problem, verse 12, Echtov loi rubei toirosi kamoi zohor nechshavu. Echtov is a seemingly future form of the verb indicating a continuous process. Echtovlo, I'm writing for Israel. Rubei Teirosi, the multitude of my teachings, the multitude of my Torah. There's some very interesting kesiv here, where the way that we read the verse in two words in this verse, Echtov, is different from what is actually written in the verse, which is Echtov with the Vav, and Rubei, the multitude of my teachings, Rabbo would be their teacher, alluding possibly to the sofer, the scribe, through whom the teachings of the Torah came to the people. But the problem was, Kemozor Necheshavu, they were considered to be something alien from the people, something strange. They were not willing to submit themselves to the authority of the Torah, something that had any relationship with themselves. Zivechei havovai yizebechuhu v'sov ayoichelu Adonai Eloi rotzom ato yizkor avonom v'yifkod chatoisom heimo mitzrayim yoshuvu. Here's a protest against the way that the sacrifices were handled, and this, as we shall see, applies both to Judah as well as to Ephraim, even if it was offerings that were supposed to be burned offerings. If they would offer these offerings of flesh, what would they do? They would eat they should eat the flesh instead of offering burnt offerings. God is saying to them, let them better that they should eat this meat for themselves, because God does not want these physical sacrifices. They've missed the whole point of the sacrificial service. And for that reason, now he will remember their iniquity, because it is not atoned for, since they have not repented, and he shall punish them for their sins, and the ultimate disaster of the people will occur, even though Moses had promised the people shall not go back to Egypt, and even though it is prohibited in the Torah for the people to return to Egypt, in fact it's prophesied here that they will return to Egypt, and we see this in the closing sections of the prophet Jeremiah. After the account of the destruction of the temple, we see that the remains of the people that were still in Judea eventually did go into exile to Egypt, and disaster befell them there. So this was the ultimate disaster, the ultimate humiliation for the people, that the whole exile recurred, and indeed until really the beginnings of the state of Israel in 1948, there were for millennia extensive habitations of Jews also in Egypt. So again, returning in this concluding verse of this parasha, which ends now after the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 is a new parasha petucha. Vayishkach Yisrael es oisehu vayiven heicholois vayudo hirebo orim betzurois veshilachti eish beorov v'yochlo armanoiseho. The bottom line of this reproof: Israel has forgotten their Maker. They've built hechalot, built palaces and halls and great buildings, but the Torah had stated that once Jerusalem would emerge as the center of the divine service and the site of the temple, all other competing temples were forbidden. And so Israel had shifted away from Yerushalayim, shifted away from servitude to the house of David. And Judah was also astray. Judah, by multiplying their fortresses and seeking security through physical fortifications instead of seeking security through trust in the Torah of Hashem, the result will be that all will get burned up and consumed. I will send fire into their cities, and it shall consume their palaces. A very grim prophecy here from Hosea. And again, I think worth bearing in mind that Hosea is the father of the prophets. Presumably, these prophecies were issued one after the other, according to when the prophet received them, and many of the themes recur from chapter to chapters. We have this evocation in this very terse but very sharp language of the moral decline of Israel just prior to the exile, laying down patterns that would be repeated and continue through the whole of all of the exiles. So with that, we will now conclude our studies of the Tanakh for today, and we'll have an interval for a few minutes, after which we'll come back to our continuing studies into the laws of the prohibition of the consumption of blood and the necessary precautions that need to be taken against this in the form of salting our meat or roasting our meat, and with the added illumination of the outstanding disciple of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, Rabbi Nosson, in his Likutei Halachot. So after a short interval, we'll come back to our studies. Shalom, and back again to our studies now. Continuing with our studies in the laws of salting and roasting of meat in order to remove the blood absorbed in the meat. Shalom, today, the 30th day of the month of Shevat of the year 5778, the first day of the 2-day Rosh Chodesh of the month of Adar, the 15th of February of the year 2018, and we continue in our studies of the late Rabbi Yaakov Pfeiffer's Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the concise code on the of law on the laws of blood, salting, and roasting. Now in chapter 2, in part 2 of chapter 2 on page 7 of the text that is available for download on the web page where these audio classes are being accessed. And now we come to the question about what happens if blood has already been cooked. If the blood has been cooked, is it still subject to the same prohibition as we have stated in the case of the blood on which the soul comes out, the blood of the shchita, and also the blood that is absorbed in the meat? The blood that is absorbed in uncooked meat, for example, blood that was squeezed out or that oozed out, that is prohibited by the Torah prohibition, subject to a punishment of 39 lashes for willful violation. The consumption of the blood on which the soul came out, the actual blood of shchita, that is a more serious prohibition with a much more serious sanction of karet, of spiritual excision. But now we come to address an interesting question. If blood had actually got cooked, or if one had salted blood so much that the blood was inedible because of the amount of salt in it, some of our sages, the Rishonim, the early medieval Torah scholars, wrote that the prohibition of consumption of such blood, even if blood of an animal were already cooked, or if it were salted, that is subject to the Torah prohibition of the consumption of blood, just like blood that has not been cooked, that is still absorbed in the flesh. However, among the latter-day poskim, some have written that while it is proper to strive to take this approach into consideration, the majority of the other Rishonim, the other medieval scholars, and among the later great poskim, hold that the prohibition of blood, once it's been cooked, is no longer a Torah prohibition. It's a prohibition midrabanan. That is to say, it is a decree by the rabbis not to consume even blood that had been cooked as a gader, as a guard against breaching the Torah prohibition of consuming uncooked blood. Now, we consider that any mitzvah or any prohibition that is midrabanan, that is to say from our sages, from the majority of the true and the great Torah sages, that is considered to be a ruling that we are obliged to follow on account of the commandment in Deuteronomy to accept the words of the teachings of the Torah and the guidance of the judges of our time, namely the Torah adjudicators, the Torah poskim. That is to say, there is a mitzvah in the Torah to follow even rulings that have been instituted by the Rabbanim, as opposed to rulings that are directly explicit in the actual written Torah or brought down by tradition as rulings from Moshe Rabbeinu. But here, rulings that are called midrabanan, although we are obliged from the Torah to follow them, there are some differences in how they are applied in cases, for example, of doubt, or cases where there would be considerable financial loss in following that ruling strictly, as we shall see in the coming paragraphs. So now, if somebody had cooked some meat and there was not enough in the pot to have a quantity of 60 times in the rest of the contents of the pot, 60 times the quantity of the piece of meat that was cooked, and there arose a doubt, had that meat actually been properly salted to remove the blood before it was cooked? Well, some people say that once the piece of meat has been cooked, since the blood that is cooked, if it had not been salted, and if there was any blood in it, that blood has now been cooked. Since the prohibition of that blood is midrabanan, it's prohibited through a rabbinical ordination and not through the explicit text of the Torah. For that reason, there is room to be mekil, to rule more lightly in this case, and to permit that meat. And the reason is because of the principle that where there is a ruling midrabanan, if there is a doubt here, as there was the original doubt, we don't know, we've forgotten if that piece of meat that got into the pot, we forgot if it was or was not salted. We couldn't ascertain that. And because here there is a safek, a doubt, we have the principle safek d'Rabbanan lekula, where there is a doubt involving the application or applicability of rabbinic rule, we rule more leniently here to permit the contents of the meat, and even that piece, the contents of the pot with the meat, on account of this safek midrabanan. On the other hand, there are others who dispute that ruling and who rule more stringently that the piece of meat itself will have to be forbidden. The reason being that since we don't know if the meat was salted or not, when you take the meat from the animal, it has got blood in it. That is inescapable, and that is called a chazakah, a presumption that there was blood in the meat. And once it's a presumption that there had been something forbidden in the meat that is still there we cannot apply the principle that a sfeika d'Rabbanan lekula to judge a doubt involving a rabbinical institute, to judge it leniently. So now we see there is this dispute over the status of this piece of meat, that they don't know was it or was it not properly salted. And what are we going to do? How are we going to rule? Some people say it's permissible, others say that it's forbidden. Well, here, if there was a case of considerable financial loss, if that meat had to be thrown out, and if the pot had to be thrown out, if there would be considerable financial loss, then there is room to permit this, and this should be done only through a rabbinical authority. If the loss was going to be negligible, throwing out the piece of meat over which the uncertainty had arisen, then one should rule more stringently. So that was a case where we were not certain was the meat properly salted or not. The next issue we shall address is meat that certainly was not salted or roasted before being cooked. In other words, no process of koshering the meat, of removing the forbidden blood, was performed before they put the meat into a pot to cook. Now, if there was not sufficient content in the rest of the pot, 60 times the quantity of the piece of meat that had not been salted or roasted that was being cooked there, then the pot is forbidden, and the meat is most certainly forbidden. Well, now, what will happen if afterwards this piece of meat that was cooked without being salted or roasted, what if this piece of meat gets mixed up with two other pieces of meat that are definitely kosher? So there are some who say that in this case, because the prohibition of blood that has already been cooked is a prohibition that is midrabanan, we can actually permit the whole thing. In other words, since in this pot, even though there was not sufficient to nullify the presence of any blood that exuded from the meat that was not salted or roasted during the cooking process, there are those who consider that any blood that's either oozed out or is still contained in the meat, since the prohibition of that blood is midrabanan, then therefore, since this has already happened, the whole pot is permitted for consumption. Now we're talking about where one piece of meat that we knew had not been salted got mixed up with two pieces that we knew were salted. And here we have a case of bitul barov, simple case where, according to this opinion, there's now three pieces of meat and we no longer recognize which was the one that was not salted. They've all been cooked already, and if there was any blood in or oozed out of the meat that had not been salted, it's already blood that has been cooked. So this is the prohibition is midrabanan. So we're using the law of rov, of a simple majority of two kosher piece of meat as opposed to one that was not properly salted, where the prohibition now is midrabanan because the blood's already been cooked. There we rule that according to the law of rov, it's permissible to eat all of the three of them, except that there is a custom. Our custom is to take one of those pieces, even though we don't know which it is, and cast it out, and we will not, we have the custom, even though we have nullified that piece that was not salted by employing the principle of rov, majority. Nevertheless, the custom is to, since we know that one of those three pieces was not kosher, even though we can't recognize which it is customary not to have benefit from all three. And so this way, when we only have two left that we will consume, there's a doubt. Perhaps there is isur, prohibited meat, but it's not certain. And for that reason, our custom is to permit the eating of two of the three pieces. So that is a more lenient opinion in this case. However, there are many other poskim that dispute this, and here where the piece of meat that was not salted got mixed up with two other pieces, they will not permit that mixture unless the piece of meat that had not been salted or roasted before cooking got mixed up with 60 other pieces of kosher meat. Here we are saying that we could not accept the simple ruling of Rav, a simple majority of two kosher pieces against one, on the grounds that this is a isur midrabanan. These people who dispute that more lenient ruling say you have to have a bitul b'shishim, a quantity of 60 times the amount of the meat that was definitely not salted in order to permit this mixture. And they say that even where there is an isur midrabanan, where the prohibition is one through rabbinical enactment, we require 60 times the quantity of the non-kosher meat in there. And there are others who add further that even if everywhere else we consider that in the case of a prohibition that was through a rabbinical enactment, like that where you have dry substances, like 3 pieces of meat, where one was not properly salted and the other 2 were, that is called dry with dry. Normally, even those who hold that if the prohibition is midrabanan, we can permit it with a simple Rav majority of 2 to 1. In this case, in the case of blood, even though it's been cooked, there are grounds to take a more stringent view, as we just said, to only permit the bitul, the nullification, if there was 60 times the amount of kosher reason. The reason being that even though the prohibition of blood, once it's been cooked, is instituted by the sages, midrabanan, it's very, very close to the Torah prohibition, and it would be very easy to come to stumble. And for that reason, one should be more stringent here and treat even blood that has been cooked as if it was permitted, as if it was forbidden midoraisa through the strict letter of the Torah. And only if there was going to be a considerable loss financially involved should one consult a competent rabbinical authority. Now, all of the above applies where the lump of meat that got into the pot did not have 60 times the rest of the pot's contents, 60 times its own quantity to nullify it. But if in the original pot that the lump of meat that had not been properly salted fell in, if the pot did have 60 times quantity of other ingredients, vegetables and gravy and so on, 60 times more than this piece of meat, we are going to forbid the consumption of the piece of meat itself, because this, if we could recognize it and knew which one it was, as we already learned in the previous section of this chapter, the piece of meat itself is forbidden. However, if this piece of meat now got mixed up with 2 other pieces of kosher meat, and we could no longer recognize which was the one that was cooked without being salted, as opposed to these other 2 kosher pieces. The one that was not salted was cooked in a saucepan with more than 60 times its quantity. In this case, we can rule that where there is a mix-up now of 1 lump of meat, non-kosher, with 2 that are kosher, we can apply the principle of batel berov, that it's 2 to 1 majority, which will permit the 3 pieces, and we do not even in this case need to remove one of the pieces according to the custom we mentioned earlier. And the reason for this is because since there was in the pot where the original piece that was not salted was cooked, it had 60 times the quantity of that piece of meat. For the reason why we forbid the piece of meat, if we could recognize it, is actually considered to be a chumrah, a stringency. But the actual fact is that the blood probably all ran out during the cooking process, and since the reason for forbidding the piece of meat, if we recognize it, will be a chumrah, then there is in this case where the piece of meat got mixed up with 2 other kosher pieces, we can apply the principle of batel berov. Well, that might all seem quite technical, and indeed these laws and rules are quite intricate, and it takes time to get used to them. So now to go to a wider dimension of this subject by turning now to the teachings of Rabbi Nassan of Breslev, now coming into his his discourse to actually address the subject of the actual prohibition of blood itself. So in his discourse in Likutei Halachot, Yerodea, the laws of forbidden fat and blood, Reb Nosson tells us, V'zeh bechinas isur dam, here we come to the category of the prohibition of blood, which we'll now address. Previously, we had been addressing the prohibition of chelev, the forbidden fats, but now we come to the prohibition of blood. For the blood, he says, that is the soul. The blood, as we see written explicitly in the Torah in several places, the blood is the soul. That is to say, the physical blood is the seat of the soul, which is the vitality of the animal. For that reason, the unholy forces, the other side, have their hold in the blood of the creature more than anywhere else, because the main hold of the forces of unholiness will always be in the place where there is the greatest vitality and holiness, because the unholy forces have been created to obscure, cover over, conceal, draw nurture from the holy, and subvert and divert the holy. And for that reason, all of the flaws and all of the sins come through the blood. Now, this is a very important concept in Hasidic psychology, that it is considered to be the blood in the person that is because of the hold of the unholy forces in the blood upon which the soul rides and resides, that all of the flaws and sins come through the blood, through the boiling of the blood of the 365 arteries and veins of the body. And from these, corresponding to these 365 veins and arteries of the body, called the gidin, we call them, normally this word gidin in English is called the sinews. It can refer also to nerves running through the body, like the sciatic nerve, the gid hanoshe. And here these places where the blood is running through, they correspond to the 365 prohibitions of the Torah. That is to say that the Torah seeks to protect us from the temptations and the dangers of the forces of unholiness, and the 365 prohibitions of the Torah, all boundaries that keep us away from the being exposed to the attack of the unholy forces. And now, therefore, the blood channels are the places where the unholy forces can attack and try to get us to go astray and to breach one or more of the 365 prohibitions of the Torah. And there is one commandment which encompasses all of the others, and that is the commandment of the covenant, which is the covenant of Israel's loyalty to God, who in the merit of that covenant offers Israel his unique protection and providence. And this one commandment of bris, the numerical value of the word bris is actually 612, Bet 2, Resh 200, Yud 10, and Taf 400, 612, and with the actual concept itself, that is 613. The covenant encompasses all of the Torah, and thus the covenant is protection, the observance of the covenant is protection for all of the sinews and veins and arteries of the body, which are themselves corresponding to the 365 prohibitions of the Torah that make up the sanctions of the covenant, as Reb Nachman has explained elsewhere. Reb Nachman has explained that the main reason for people diverging from the observance of the covenant, which means moral purity and particularly sexual purity and observance of the laws of modesty and restraint of the Torah, straying from this, the pagam, the flaw in this, attacks all of the veins and sinews of the body through the boiling of the blood. And that is essentially why, explains Rabbi Nosson, why it's forbidden to consume the blood. However, he says, since there is not the same concentrated vitality, the high level of vitality that exists in the forbidden fats, as we saw earlier, because in the forbidden fats is clothed the vitality that relates to the brain itself. However, the blood is considered on a lower level in the hierarchy of the soul of the person, because the brain is the seat of the neshama, the seat, the root soul rooted in God's throne of glory, a literal part of God above. But the neshama breathes down its influence into the world through the ruach, which breathes vitality into the nefesh, and the blood is the seat of the nefesh, and there in the blood is clothed the last level of the vitality. That is the level that is called the nefesh. For the blood is formed from what is left, the residue of the nutrients. In other words, as we saw earlier, the body allocates the different levels of the nutrients contained in what we ingest to the brain and to the heart and to the liver. And whereas the choicest oils and nutrients go to the brain, the blood has what is left over. And for that reason, explains Reb Nosson, after the slaughter and death of the animal, when the nefesh, the soul, and the chiyus, the life of the animal, go out from there, afterwards the blood is poured out like water, and mostly is not needed at all. It's not used because no vitality is contained in it anymore except a very little residue. For all of the vitality comes out of the blood at the time of the death of the animal, the time of the slaughter of the animal. And that's why it is forbidden to make a regular business out of blood, because the little vitality that is clothed in the blood is flawed on account of its diminutive quantity, and on account of this there's very little need for this, and it generally is not worth any money at all. On the other side, the chelev fat, on account of there being clothed there a very exalted level of vitality that has fallen from the choicest vitality of the brain, for that reason, even after the death of the animal, there still remains in the chelev fats a great amount of vitality and something of value and importance. And for that reason, it has a great use, and it is worth a considerable amount of money because of its great level and importance. Even though the Sitra Ahara, the other side, the forces of unholiness, are clothed there very strongly. Even so, the essential vitality that is in the chalev fat is not flawed. And that is why, as we've seen above, it's permitted for trading in. The Torah explicitly permits using chalev for lechol malacha, for every purpose, like making of candles, working of leathers, etc. Because the vitality that is clothed in the chalev fat is on the level of moichin, of brain power, mind power, comes from the higher level. That is to say, it comes from the lowest level of the moichin, what is called if the moichin are themselves, chokhmah, bina, and da'at, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, if they are seen as a complete koma, a partsuf that has a head, arms, and legs, so the vitality that's in the chalev comes from the legs of the brain. Because the chalev is the residue of the fats that were feeding the brain, like the brain being the wick with the soul shining from the brain. And the actual place of the chalev is in the flanks of the animals by the kidneys, which is where the counsel comes from. And the counsel is considered to be the raglayim, the legs of the brain, netzach and hod, which are the two sfirot that correspond to the klayot, the kidneys, and the legs. They are called the legs of the brain, because the klayot are in the category of the legs, as is brought in Kabbalistic writings. And for that reason, the vitality of the chalev is one that is a beneficial divine flow of influence, of vitality, which has a monetary value. And the chalev are the moichin and the da'at, the brain and the knowledge and understanding of the soul, which is considered in the category of the nukva, the maiden, the receiving element in relation to the levels of influence above her. And this we find specifically in the words of Rabbi Nachman, where he writes in Likutei Moharan, Part 1, Torah 69, that he was very particular to phrase it in this way, that money is the source of the soul. In other words, material wealth, which is the ability, which we need, material substance, which we need for the soul to even appear in this world. This money and its highest level is the very root of the soul. And the root, says Reb Nosson, if Reb Nachman called the mammon, the material sustenance, the root of the soul, the root itself is the category of the moichin, the brain. Because the moichin, the brain, the nucleus, are the source and the vitality of everything. As it's written, v'hachochma techayeh, it is wisdom that gives vitality. So therefore, material substance, that is the root of the soul, and that is its vitality. And the moichin, the brain power of the soul, which is the feminine aspect, comes from the level of the legs of the level that is above her, namely the legs of the brain, which the level above the nukva, the feminine, is the masculine aspect that is sending forth the influence. The masculine aspect is the moichin, the brain power, and it's sending forth the influence to the level below it, to the receiving element of the nukva. And that is where the mammon, the material substance and wealth is. And we find this alluded to in Genesis, where Jacob says to Lavan, Vayivorech Hashem oitzcho l'ragli, you have blessed, Hashem has blessed you l'ragli, literally to my legs, that is to say, on account of me. For the level of the legs is the level of the legs of the higher aspect will be the root of the vitality and the brain of the lower aspect. And for that reason, physical substance, wealth, and money are, as it were, the legs of the brain, and that is the source of the vitality of the soul, namely this is the brain of the soul. It comes out that from this discussion, the vitality that is contained in the chalev fat, which is the feet, as it were, of the level of the brain, this is tantamount to shefa shel mammon, to a positive influence that has monetary value, being as it is the source of the soul. And this is a very exalted level of vitality. And for that reason, continues Reb Nosson, we can extract monetary benefit from the chalev fat. We can do business with the chalev fat. And here we have this is alluded to in the whiteness of the chalev fat, because the chalev fat is drawing its nurture from the whiteness of the brain, because the fat is called a klipat lavan. This is called the husk of Laban. Now, the blood itself is in the category of Esau, who came out from Rebekah, his mother, all red. And Esau corresponds to the aspect of the liver, which is full of blood, as Reb Nachman has explained in Likutei Moharan, chapter 57. And therefore, in the case of Lavan, even though he is an impure husk, a very impure aspect of the forces of unholiness, nevertheless there still remains in Lavan much holy vitality of a very exalted nature. And though this vitality, this came out in the daughters of Laban, who were the wives of Jacob, together with the root of the souls of the wives of Jacob, which lay in wealth for the reasons we have just been hearing about. And that's why Jacob was willing to struggle until he was able to extract those souls, the daughters of Laban and their children, with their very root, namely their wealth. And for that reason, after he already married them, he exerted himself very greatly with Laban in order to extract from him the very root of their vitality, namely the wealth that he took out from Laban. And that's what is written when Jacob takes his wives out into the field and tells them he's got to go. They agree with him and they say to him, for all of the wealth that God has saved from our father, it belongs to us specifically, because it is ours. It belongs to Rachel and Leah, because this money of Laban's is their very source, their very spiritual root, their ability to come down into the world and to exist. And that is why Jacob said to Laban, as just quoted a little earlier, Jacob says to Laban, Hashem has blessed you on my account, namely for my legs, for the female aspects to which I'm sending down influence. For Jacob is the aspect of the holy soul. And he argues against Laban that all of the wealth that Laban had absorbed and tried to consume, everything came only from the fallen legs of holiness. That is to say, it is from the legs of the aspect of the brain that Lavan who is the white, thick fat, is drawing his nurture, and that is why he has all the wealth, and that's why Jacob exerted himself to break the husk of Laban, to take out this wealth, which is the source of the souls of his wives. But Esau, who corresponds to the impurity of gold, that is to say, when we smelt gold to extract the pure gold, there is much waste that comes out, and this is the side of Esau, whose nurture comes from the extraneous, from the waste of the blood, which is left after all of the vitality of holiness has gone out of the blood. And that's why no vitality of holiness is left in the blood except a most tiny residual amount, and it is absorbed in the blood and very, very highly damaged. And that's why there never came forth from Esau to the side of holiness any souls in the way that there did from Laban, from whom a very beautiful and exalted holiness came out, pure and white without a flaw. So with this, my friends, we will conclude our studies today. We've had some very intricate concepts in the halakha and some equally intricate concepts in the Hasidut of Reb Nosson, and I hope that B'ezrat Hashem we will be able to work our minds around these concepts. And now at Rosh Chodesh Adar, let me wish you Chodesh Tov Vorach, and for this coming Shabbat Shalom Umevorach, and God willing, I'll be back with you on this coming Sunday at 1600 hours Jerusalem time. Until then, again, Chodesh Tov Vorach and Shabbat Shalom Umevorach.